Hello everyone and welcome back to Hard Knot Life Sailing. If you're new here, welcome. We do a lot of sailing, but we do a little bit of boats, hands-on repairs and manufacturing or building things as well. If you haven't seen our series on the hardtop, this whole enclosure here, we made quite a few videos on step-by-step how I built this whole enclosure. And today we're going to build a table, or better yet, modify this table. A problem we've always had with this table is when we sit, our food, our hands, our bowl of soup is never in front of us. We have to lean very far over to use this table. Now this table cannot be permanently really wide, or you can't walk around it. So this is the ideal size for most of the time. But when we're eating out here, we really wanted it to be wider. We hopefully have all the materials we need. This was the one thing difficult to find out here, but we were able to get it. It's a double pin hinge. And we were waiting to get this before we start this project. I've looked all over the internet and I cannot find any other videos about people making tables with these double pin hinges. So hopefully this will be very useful for other people wanting to do a project like this, whether it's for your house or your boat, your workshop, computer desk, whatever the case being. But these are a unique type of hinge. And what we're going to do is make this table fold open to be a more useful table. So what we're going to show you is how to turn this into this. Alright, so my first step here is we're going to be removing this table because that is the first step to do here. Alright, the next step here, I'm going to take my existing table. Not so pretty on the bottom. We can fix that. Just taping off a center line. I'm really hoping my saw doesn't cut this tape off. Otherwise I'm gonna have to clamp something on there. You know what, F that. I'm just gonna clamp something anyways. Alright, so I taped off my center line here just to mark it as a reference. 18 1/4, so I want to mark 9 1/8. 9 1/8. I'll check that here. It's 9 1/8. That's my center line, and that's where we have to cut this table. I do not have a table saw because I live on a boat. What I do have is this micro skill saw. Now it'll cut through this material plus only a little bit, so the remainder part here is going to be cut even a little bit more carefully. I'm going to try and clean this blade up a little bit because I only have one. It feels sharp, but it's also quite dirty. When you get the bit of residues on the sides of the blades, that makes blades heat up faster and they get a lot of friction. So if you're having trouble pushing, say, your skill saw through a piece of ripping down the length of lumber or something, take a look at the side of your blade. If it has residues, especially if you've been cutting plywood or particle board, it gets a lot of glue residues, and that slows your blade down, causes a lot of unnecessary friction, making it harder to push through, which in turn becomes more dangerous. I've been a carpenter most of my life, and this here is the only saw I've ever hurt myself with. I've never been cut by anything. I've never had any sort of accident in carpentry for the 25 plus years that I've been doing it professionally. But this saw particularly, when I was cutting a small piece, had to use this basically as a table saw. It got jammed on the wood and it kicked back and ran up my thumb. So now I have a funky nail there, but it healed well. Put that behind us, but just goes to show, even after 25 years, you got to be very careful with your tools, holding them properly. Since I don't have a table saw, and I don't really want to freehand this because this is a crucial cut. This is the finished side of this table. You're going to be looking at this all the time. That has to be very straight, has to be a nice clean cut, as clean as possible. So what I'm going to do, perhaps this will work, I'm going to set up a rip fence that will prevent this sliding. See, this will work nicely. What I'm going to do is set up this square as a guide so that the saw runs nice and straight along my line. So I'm going to measure over, depending on which direction I'm going, measuring from the outside of this to the inside of the blade and keeping that measurement, the distance between the line and the ruler here, and that'll give me a nice guide to cut. If you don't have a pair of these yet, these are the brand name Vice Grip clamps. These are extremely handy. I've used these as a cabinet installer for about 20 years. This is actually my first pair I ever bought and the only pair I ever bought. These will last you your entire life. So it's a good tool to have. and it gets into a lot of places. You can clamp something very quickly with one hand. So if you had to hold this still, like in this case, I can reach around the edge of the drip edge or whatever you want to call it and clamp that directly where I want it easily with one hand. And when you have a surface that you don't want marked up, you just take some tape and put some little cushions over top of the pads. If you have other types of like bar clamps and they come with the plastic pads, you know they never last. Those pads always break or fall off. But simply putting a little bit of masking tape on there adds that little layer of protection so it doesn't scratch if you have to use it on like a painted surface or a finished surface. Alright, got this blade cleaned up a bit. There's no sticky residues or anything. It's gonna have to do for now because I don't know where I'm gonna find a 3 3/8 blade here, and I don't want to wait a few weeks for one to come because I gotta do stuff. You may have noticed I put a pull tie on the top of this saw. This saw, how it works, is like a plunger. You push it down to show the blade and then you make your cut. I've always found that incredibly dangerous because you have to hold it perfectly square to where you're cutting while you're pushing down, and if it shifts at all, it's going to jump back out at you. I'd rather just have the blade exposed and enter my cut like a regular skill saw. Having to push it down means you're putting a lot of added pressure on this, and if you don't hold it perfectly as you're plunging it, like I said, it'll jump out at you. So I just put this on to keep the whole table pulled back, exposing the entire blade for the duration of using this. Alright, an update to that. This Rockwell saw is a piece of it's not good for anything where you want any kind of precision. I noticed it before I started. If you saw me in the time lapse, I kept measuring over from the outside edge of this to the blade, and it was 1/16 off over these 3 inches. And I was trying to tap that with a hammer, trying to get it to square up. But this platform or table, whatever, is simply not square to the blade. I could actually see it slightly looking down the line of this. It's not perfectly in line. So even with using a guide and keeping that tight to it, the blade wanting to go on an angle pulled into the wood and probably was bending the blade as it was cutting, because the saw itself never moved, but the blade was cutting on an angle. So I now have a bad cut, which I'm very displeased about. So I'm gonna have to take this to a shop here in Luperon and get them to cut this, because that saw is useless for this job. It's only good for freehand cutting things that don't need any kind of precision, because I could have freehand that better than what I did even using a guide. It simply did not follow the guide. My guide was here, so it didn't pull away from the guide. It actually bent the blade going closer to my guide, which the guide should have prevented that. But the saw is so unprecision that it ruined it. Now, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to take it somewhere, and we're gonna have to cut it to the shortest point on one side, cut it, flip it, and cut the other side off, wasting about maybe an eighth of material will be wasted, because now I have to center it on that defected part. It's not gonna make much of a difference, just the table will be 1/8 of an inch less, and have to do 2 cuts instead of 1 cut. I've contacted a guy locally, and unfortunately we have to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning. We're going to be leaving here very early because he's not in walking distance. We need to get transportation to get up to his shop. He's only there for 30 minutes in the morning. We'll see you there. How's that for a parking job?
Very good.
Vámonos, mi amor.
Not in the dark, not in the dark, stars slowly glow. Echoes in the dark, feeling it.
Alright, we're back and we got these pieces cut. I used a local gentleman. Won't mention names. Unfortunately, it didn't come back how I explained it. Actually received the table that I asked him to square off to the size of this one, and I even I received it back cut in half. It took a while because the directions, I guess, were not clear enough for him. I ended up getting my new table cut in half, and then my old table that actually had the line drawn on, taped and drawn on it for where I wanted it to be cut in half. And he did nothing to this table, even though I had the cut started and explained this is why I'm coming to you, because my saw's not working proper. So instead of finishing that cut, he actually cut my brand new table in half. So everything's taken a little while longer because we had to get this re-seamed. So this has to get a spline installed inside of the table. So I've got that back now, and we're going to start working on preparing this to become... What is warped here? Well, gravity's going to have to take over and take that warp out of that. So this is what I wanted. It's all good now. After the spline got put in there, there's a bit of a warp somewhere here. So this is going to be our table that we see while we're sailing, and then when we're going to eat on it, this is going to fold open like that, making a double wide table, which is very needed on this boat. First thing we're going to do is line these up perfectly. So I'm just going to use a square and some clamps. We're going to line that up, and we're going to mark exactly where those hinges are going to go. Alright, now what I've done is marked the width of these hinges, made sure it was square. I went 4 inches into the beginning of the hinge so that they're well spaced out. I think that's a adequate amount of space. I marked with this at the center how wide this, I don't know what you want to call that, a knuckle is, because this is going to be installed inside of here, but it's going to get set back right inside the wood so that this is flush. That's the idea. I want this piece to be flush on the outside, and I want those pads of the hinge, or the plates, to be flush to the top. So this is all going to get set inside of the wood. So right now we're just marking off where those are going to be. I'm going to be doing the same here now. So this is the width of the hinge. Once this hinge is flush to the outside here, I want to follow the contour of the hinge. So it's not going to be a square cut, it's going to be following the shape of this hinge. Now you can lay this upside down. Hopefully you can see this. So I marked out how far that's going to be, and this first bit is going to go down a lot deeper, just until this pin is on the inside of the wood. So that section, I can mark it now. That looks about right. So this. The notch on this side going in is going to come back this far on both, allowing the hinge to come all the way to here. That's going to allow this hinge to set right inside here. And the depth is probably the same thing. It's like 1/2 millimeter off, but I'm measuring 1/2 millimeter less. So if I got to take a little bit more off, I'll just take a little bit more off. Do the exact same thing on this. I'm going to mark my depth here. So this one should be going. These hinges are going to get mounted this way and that deep, so they go flush on the top and flush inside when they're in the closed position, which is like that. So this becomes flush on the outside. So nothing here will stick out. That'll be flush, and this will also be flush this way. I just marked P here so I don't mess up the hinges. That's port side, port side. Alright, so what I did is got my little handy handheld router here, or edger, whatever you want to call this. I call it a handheld router. And I set the depth here for as low as I want to go on this, and for the top I'm just gonna have to eyeball that. This top line you're not gonna see because that is where that's gonna be underneath the hinge plate, but I still want to follow along that pretty close. So that is the depth for my hinge plate. See, it's gonna go a little bit lower once this part here gets sunken in. And I can just take a chisel and clean those edges up there, those corners up. So now we're gonna cut the depth of this. So all I gotta do now is notch out these little corners with a chisel. Now this isn't very difficult to do. Teak is not a hard wood, so I mean I keep my chisel pretty sharp, but nevertheless teak is a fairly soft wood, and that is a freaking perfect fit. Marvel in that. So this is nice and flush on the top. This hinge will flip over and it is flush on the bottom. So that is pretty perfect. Once that's tucked in there, you can see how close that seam is. Not bad for my first one, so I'm going to keep moving on and do all the rest of these. Alright, the last step now. You can see when these rotate, because this is not round, this is square. So as it rotates, it actually takes up more space. So what I'm going to be doing here is putting an additional little notch just where the center piece is. An additional little notch, probably only a couple more millimeters. And it's going to freehand that with the router. Alright, I tried the first one with the router. I didn't love how it went. Still leaves me having to chisel it out a bit in the end. So I think the next one I'm just going to chisel the whole thing out. Alright, that is perfect. This hinge moves now without touching anything. It just needed a little bit more of a rabbit out of there. Alright, that touches nothing now. So I got those hinges in now. This is how they're going to work. I got a nice tight fit here. There's a tiny little 1 millimeter gap here in the front, but these aren't fully adjusted yet. They're going to be getting tapped in actually a little bit. I got to align them perfectly before I put the screws in it. But before I get that far, I just wanted to give a quick little demonstration of how this is going to work. So the hinge is going up like this, and this will drop down over top of it, and this is how it's going to look on the outside. And now this will fold open like so, but without screws in it, it's a little hard to hold, but that, you can get the idea. So the reason why we got to notch all this out is because we don't want a great big gap here. If we don't notch these right in, this would end up being a 3/4 inch gap between these hinges, but this way it's almost flush. And you'll sure the hinges will be exposed when the table's open. There's no way around that. But well, there is, but I'm not going to that length. You'd have to bury them like this and then do a veneer skin over the whole thing, which I'm not going that distance. But this is where we're at right now. So for today, I'm gonna wrap this up, and we're gonna get back to this once I get some. Actually, I'm gonna do it with some temporary screws. We don't have the screws I want for these. I want a very specific screw. What I'm trying to find is a 5/8 system screw. That might be difficult to get here, so I might actually have to customize one myself. I'm going to use maybe a number 8 screw, stainless screw, and have to cut off most of it, leaving only 5/8 of an inch. Because I don't want to use a regular 5/8 screw, because they're very short, they go to a very sharp point, so there's not a lot of threads to grab hold of the wood. But with the system screws, they don't have a point on it. So it's very thick and has a lot more surface area that grabs the wood. So they hold much stronger. And I'm gonna hope to find those. We're going to San Diego in a couple of days. And if I can't find those screws, I'm gonna buy something else and I'm gonna make my own system screws, and I'll show you how I'll do that if I can't buy them myself. So stay tuned.
And still, heartbeat slows down, feel the
Thank you so much for watching the first part of our video on making a cockpit table. We hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful. Stay tuned for the next episode where we'll dive into the second part of the process. See you then.